a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Mel Gibson has spoken publicly about his Christian faith, and a story often circulating online claims that the Ethiopian Bible has preserved an ancient warning for nearly 1,700 years, a warning that many believe never became part of the Bible most Christians read today. Before we continue, if you enjoy exploring ancient mysteries, hidden biblical history, and thought-provoking documentaries, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation. The claim begins with a striking comparison. Most people know the King James Bible as containing 66 books, while the Ethiopian Orthodox biblical tradition includes 88. Supporters of this idea argue that those additional books contain messages and prophecies that were left outside the Western biblical canon. According to this interpretation, one of those writings describes a generation unlike any before it, not through symbols or mysterious visions, but in direct language. It speaks of people who fill churches, know the language of faith, and yet slowly drift away from the heart of its message. Mel Gibson has often been open about the seriousness of his Christian beliefs. "I was born into a Catholic family. I'm very Christian in my beliefs. I do actually believe this stuff completely." Those who promote this theory argue that the warning isn't describing some distant future. They believe it is speaking about the world we live in today, and that the generation being described is our own. The story then turns to Ethiopia, where Christianity has existed since the 4th century. Unlike much of the Western Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition developed independently for centuries, preserving manuscripts in the ancient language of Ge'ez. Inside remote mountain monasteries, monks carefully copied these texts by hand, passing them from one generation to the next. One monastery often mentioned is Debri Damo in northern Ethiopia. Standing high above the surrounding landscape, and traditionally reached by climbing a long leather rope, it has become a symbol of ancient Christian tradition. There, monks have dedicated their lives to preserving handwritten manuscripts, using techniques that have changed little over the centuries. Supporters of this narrative argue that these manuscripts survived outside the historical process that shaped the biblical canon recognized by much of Western Christianity. They point to the early church councils and suggest that not every Christian tradition was represented when decisions about the canon were made. Some scholars who study Ethiopian manuscripts note that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved texts that are unfamiliar to many Western Christians. Online discussions often go further, claiming that certain writings were never widely translated because their contents challenged religious institutions themselves. These interpretations remain debated and are not accepted as historical fact by mainstream scholars. Among the writings frequently mentioned is a text known as the Book of the Covenant. According to those who emphasize its significance, it records teachings Jesus gave his disciples during the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension, a period that receives relatively little detail in the 4 canonical Gospels. Supporters believe those 40 days contained some of Christ's most direct instructions. Rather than speaking in parables, they claim he spoke openly about future generations, spiritual deception, and the challenges believers would face in the final age. According to this interpretation, the message describes a time when many people would appear deeply religious on the outside while losing sight of the faith's true purpose. Whether viewed as history, tradition, or theological speculation, these ancient Ethiopian texts continue to spark curiosity and debate among those interested in the earliest Christian writings. According to this interpretation, the message is neither symbolic nor intentionally obscure. Those who preserved these writings believed the warning was expressed with remarkable clarity in spiritual terms, so important that it had to be protected, yet so powerful that it was shared only with great caution. What comes first in the narrative surprises many readers. It is not a vision of fire falling from heaven. It is not the sudden collapse of nations or an army at the gates. Instead, the story begins with something quieter. It describes what supporters call the gradual fading of conscience, a slow spiritual decline that unfolds over generations. The change is so gradual, they argue, that people living through it rarely recognize it while it is happening. In this interpretation, truth slowly gives way to spectacle. Religious influence grows, yet genuine compassion becomes harder to find. Faith remains visible in words and ceremonies, while its deeper purpose is increasingly overlooked. The warning, as believers understand it, is directed first toward those who claim to represent the faith rather than toward distant enemies. It challenges religious communities to examine themselves before looking elsewhere for signs of spiritual decline. Mel Gibson has often emphasized that understanding the larger biblical story requires looking back to its earliest chapters. To really tell the story properly, you have to start with the fall of the angels. Within this interpretation, spiritual corruption rarely presents itself openly. Instead, it appears familiar, speaks the language of faith, and can exist alongside outward expressions of religion while quietly contradicting the values it claims to uphold. The narrative then shifts toward descriptions of the natural world. Earthquakes, floods, and unusual signs in the heavens are portrayed not simply as disasters, but according to this tradition, as reminders that history is moving toward a decisive moment. Even so, the greater concern is not physical upheaval. The deeper warning focuses on the human heart. Supporters of these texts argue that the greatest danger is becoming spiritually indifferent, reaching a point where compassion, conviction, and the search for truth slowly disappear without anyone noticing. Stories about Ethiopian monastic tradition describe scribes copying these passages with exceptional care, believing that their responsibility was not to soften difficult words, but to preserve them exactly as they had received them. Another ancient Christian work sometimes discussed alongside these writings is the Didaskalia. Some interpreters believe it expands on the theme by describing a final system of influence, not necessarily a single nation or empire, but a way of life that shapes people's thinking without obvious force. According to this reading, control is maintained not through fear alone, but through comfort, distraction, and endless satisfaction. People become so accustomed to their surroundings that they stop questioning them altogether. The image is that of a cage whose walls are almost impossible to recognize because they have always been there. In this interpretation, the greatest consequence is not suffering, but spiritual numbness, a life in which people possess material security while gradually losing their sense of purpose. The questions that once defined human existence begin to fade. Who am I? Why am I here? And what was I created for? According to this interpretation, humanity gradually loses sight of life's deepest questions. Instead of asking, "What do I owe to others?" or "Why am I here?" people become consumed by smaller, more immediate concerns. What should I watch next? What should I buy? What should I share online? Supporters of these writings argue that this shift is one of the defining signs of spiritual decline. They describe those who continue searching for truth, despite constant distraction, as especially blessed. People who recognize the comforts surrounding them without allowing those comforts to replace compassion, purpose, or love. Mel Gibson has spoken about how certain ancient Christian writings deeply affected him. In interviews, he has suggested that some passages feel surprisingly relevant to modern life, reading less like distant predictions and more like reflections on challenges people experience today. The tradition then presents what it describes as 4 successive stages of the final age. Rather than focusing only on dramatic events, the emphasis is placed on gradual changes within human society and the human heart. The first stage is often described as the age of forgetting. According to this interpretation, truth does not disappear. Instead, the desire to seek it slowly fades. Daily responsibilities, endless distractions, and the pace of ordinary life crowd out the questions that once shaped human existence. No single decision marks the change. People simply become occupied with everything else until they no longer notice what has been left behind. Within Ethiopian Christian tradition, some commentators describe this as the most deceptive stage because it feels comfortable rather than alarming. Outwardly, society may appear to be advancing, even as its deeper spiritual awareness quietly diminishes. The second stage is known as the age of spectacle. Here, constant stimulation replaces quiet reflection. Entertainment, controversy, and an endless stream of information fill nearly every moment, leaving little room for silence or contemplation. Supporters of this interpretation argue that genuine reflection requires stillness, and when every pause is filled with distraction, the ability to listen for deeper meaning gradually weakens. Modern readers often draw comparisons to today's digital world, though these connections are contemporary interpretations rather than claims made by the ancient texts themselves. The third stage is called the Age of the False Shepherd. According to this tradition, the greatest spiritual danger does not necessarily come from open opponents of faith, but from individuals who appear to represent it while pursuing entirely different goals. The warning emphasizes the difficulty of recognizing deception when it closely resembles the genuine article. The closer the imitation, the more convincing it becomes. Scholars who study Ethiopian Christianity note that this theme has inspired centuries of theological discussion within that tradition, with generations of commentators exploring its meaning and application. The fourth and final stage is described as the Great Silence. In this interpretation, the greatest loss is not the disappearance of the divine, but humanity's growing inability to perceive it. After generations of distraction and spiritual indifference, many people come to accept that absence of connection as normal. Those living through this period, the tradition suggests, may never realize anything has changed because they have known no other experience. The warning ultimately invites readers to ask whether the greatest danger is not dramatic catastrophe, but the gradual loss of wonder, compassion, and the willingness to seek truth before that loss becomes impossible to recognize. Then, in the deepest moment of silence, the fire returns, not to destroy the world, but to awaken it one last time. According to these Ethiopian writings, Jesus says, "The ones who will endure are not simply the religious or the comfortable. They are the people who remained faithful to love and truth when the world chose power and convenience. They will be recognized not by their achievements, but by the scars they carry." But before that day arrives, the writings describe 7 inner barriers that every person must overcome. Tradition says the monks of Debre Damo debated these teachings for centuries before committing them to writing. Even the discovery of multiple copies of the Book of Enoch among the Dead Sea Scrolls showed how highly some ancient communities valued these forgotten texts. These are called the 7 seals of the heart. Unlike the seals in Revelation, they are not signs in the heavens or disasters on earth. They represent an invisible battle taking place within every human soul. The first seal is comfort, choosing an easy life instead of embracing difficult truths. The second is pride, believing there is nothing left to learn. The third is fear, placing safety above conviction until silence feels wiser than speaking the truth. The fourth seal is distraction, filling every quiet moment with endless entertainment, so the soul never has to listen. The fifth is false community, surrounding yourself only with voices that agree with you until the echo becomes your reality. The sixth is false mercy, accepting forgiveness without allowing it to transform your life. And finally comes the seventh and most dangerous seal, empty religion. It is knowing the language of faith, practicing every ritual, and speaking every sacred word while remaining spiritually unchanged inside. According to these ancient teachings, only when all seven seals are broken can a person truly awaken, ready to recognize truth when the final hour arrives. According to these Ethiopian writings, those who overcome the seven seals don't simply wait for the fire from heaven. They become its living reflection. The message isn't presented as a distant prophecy, but as a mirror of today's world. A society consumed by comfort, distracted by endless noise, and filled with spiritual language that often lacks genuine transformation. We are more connected than ever, yet many feel more isolated than ever before. The texts describe a generation that values appearance over truth and influence over wisdom. Rather than predicting a far-off future, they challenge readers to ask a difficult question: are we already living in that age? The prophecy ends with what is known as the final witness. It says that in the last days, God's message will come from unexpected places, not from the powerful, but from the forgotten, the overlooked, and those without influence. These voices may be rejected by institutions and ignored by society, yet they will reach the people willing to listen. The writings suggest that those most confident in their own righteousness could be the least prepared to recognize the truth. This is why Mel Gibson continues to speak about the Ethiopian Bible. He didn't discover these ancient manuscripts. Ethiopian monks and scholars have preserved and studied them for generations. Hidden in monasteries like Debri Damo, handwritten manuscripts have survived wars, famine, and centuries of history. For Gibson, the real message isn't simply that these texts exist, it's that they have been quietly preserved for centuries, waiting for a new generation to ask what they contain. Whether viewed as history, tradition, or prophecy, the Ethiopian Bible remains one of Christianity's oldest and most fascinating collections of sacred writings, inviting readers to explore a chapter of biblical history that many have never encountered. For centuries, the monks of Ethiopia have carefully protected these ancient writings, preserving them through generations long before modern printing or digital technology existed. These manuscripts were not recently uncovered or pieced together from forgotten ruins. They have remained part of the Ethiopian Christian tradition, read, copied, and safeguarded continuously for nearly 2,000 years. The question many people ask isn't simply whether these texts are ancient. It's why so few outside Ethiopia have ever heard of them. According to these writings, Jesus teaches that the end is not the end of life, but the end of deception. What lies ahead is described as a refining fire that strips away everything false, while those who remain faithful to love and truth will endure, even when the world chooses comfort and power instead. Inside the remote monastery of Debra Damo, monks continue the same work their predecessors began centuries ago, Using ink made from soot and natural gum, they patiently copy every page by hand, preserving a tradition that has survived wars, famines, and the rise and fall of civilizations. One generation passes the work to the next, ensuring these manuscripts never disappear. The central message of these writings is simple but challenging. There is a difference between being spiritually asleep and truly awake, and that difference becomes clear only when life puts faith to the test. Whether you see these texts as history, tradition, or prophecy, they invite every reader to examine their own heart. Which of the 7 seals do you struggle with the most? Comfort, pride, fear, distraction, false community, false mercy, or empty religion? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to explore more of the ancient Ethiopian writings and the mysteries surrounding the Book of Enoch, don't miss our next video. It may reveal another fascinating chapter that many people have never encountered.